Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is you are tuning in from. We are so glad to have you here. If this is your first time, my name is Garrett. I get to be lucky enough to be the host of this series with light panels. If you've been here before, my name is still Garrett. But thanks so much for joining us. Uh, Today, believe it or not, is the last episode in our Inspire series. This year, this series of live streams has all been inspired by a particular filmmaker, cinematographer, director, what have you. If there are episodes you've missed, please feel free to go back to Light Panel's YouTube page. There are recordings of all of these live streams. You can go catch up on the things that you have missed, in addition to the previous year's videos and live streams that we have produced. But do that later. Now, stay here. Again, my name's Garrett. Thanks to Light Panels for putting this on for us. I would love to see in the chat where everybody's coming in from. I know we got people kind of from all over the place here. I would love to know where you're all tuning in from. Eric, always good to see you, coming in from Munich, Germany. Before we get into this, make sure you stay connected with both myself and with Light Panels across social media. We haven't announced what we're doing next year yet, but we're doing some really cool stuff. So if you want to tune into what we've got tuned up for next year, make sure that you subscribe to Light Panels YouTube, mine, as well as the Instagrams across the board. So today, we are looking at a fascinating filmmaker in David Lynch. This is the last of our Inspired By, and the filmmaker that we are talking to today is perfect for this style of filmmaking. Dear friend of mine, a teaching colleague at the college that we both teach at film school. Today, we have Matt Wilken. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So before we dive in and look at the three different scenes, talk a little bit about the inspiration kind of at large of David Lynch, what his style means, and kind of your thought process going into recreating the look and style.
Yeah, so David Lynch he's got a lot of different styles, I would say. But I think the big thing that he brings to the table is this mood of bringing kind of the normal and the surreal all together. I think a lot of his lighting setups kind of come from more of a television background, but he also will embrace a lot of darker shadows and really use sound design to set that mood as much as the lighting. So my inspiration going into it was kind of, how can I set a mood or a tone visually that might match with whatever sound design I would be kind of putting in there with it. So I picked a couple of different ways of going about it, but we've got more of like I would call it a happy lovers on a swing set vibe, and then a little bit more of a darker, moodier scene, followed up by another darker, moody scene, but juxtaposed with kind of some happy type music and a little bit of weirdness and otherworldly kind of brought in there a little bit as well.
Love it. As always, there's a Q&A module as well as the chat here. If you do have questions kind of throughout this live stream, the Q&A module is the easiest way for me to see those questions, but if you throw them in the chat too, I'll do my best to kind of keep up with all of that. One of the things I wanted to kind of say at the top here, we're talking about one technique that Lynch uses that we actually haven't done in any of the series that we've been up to this far, and that's lens whacking, and we'll get a little bit into that a little further on. But and look at this, we've got Kent, UK, Scotland, Montreal, Texas, New York. We got people from all over the place. It's so good to have you all here. Before we can break the different scenes down, we of course need to at least watch the first one. So without further ado, here's the first of the three scenes, and then of course, as always, we'll break it down. there's a lot to kind of get into. Before we get into the camera work or the sound design, can you first take us through the lighting?
Yeah, so it starts off, it's daytime, so there's plenty of light to get a good exposure. But when the sun was coming out from behind the clouds, it was almost like too bright. So they were really kind of falling off into shadow. So what I did is I set up this 2x1 kind of in front of them to essentially work as a fill and combat the really harsh sun backlight that's kind of giving them like this dreamy halo to it. So in the wide shots, I've just got the 2x1 sort of in front of them, off maybe 33-degree angle off center, trying to illuminate them as much as possible to kind of bring them up in the exposure. And then when I moved in for the close-ups, I brought in a 1x1 hard and kind of stuck it behind them to sort of, I guess, reinforce what was going on with the sun and warm it up even a little bit as well for some of the close-ups where she's pointing, kind of get her hair to pop a little bit more. So a relatively easy setup during the daytime, but it really kind of helped bring up those shadows on the actors and balance out what was going on with the daylight.
Okay, so one of the things that you did that I really liked was the transition from day to night. How did you get that match cut scene?
So with that, I basically figured out where the camera was, and when we came back later that night and shot the night scene, put the camera in the exact same place. So we measured, height of tripod, distance from the subjects. We also had some golf tees that we kind of stuck in the ground and put way down into the ground so that we could have like a physical marker of where the tripod legs would need to be the next day. So it was really close. It was not exact, but because I was shooting in 6K, I had the availability to kind of in post move things around a little bit. And with the swing set there, I had a very geometric pattern that I could use to sort of match those two things up. And it ended up working pretty well. I think the thing that I wasn't sure of was how to get the swing, the empty swing, swinging the same way as the actress. So that took a little bit of trial and error. I got my actor kind of swinging and was keeping track of his beats per minute so that we could, at night, I could make sure that he was kind of moving back and forth at a similar rate. And then I kind of went in there, pulled back the swing and let it go, tried to get it so that it would also go in unison with him, because I knew that that's where I wanted the switch to happen. So it took a few times of kind of guessing and checking and getting the two swings to swing together at the same time. But eventually I was pretty happy with how it turned out. I wasn't exactly sure how it was going to work, but it ended up being fairly seamless, I thought.
I mean, it worked really well for me on camera. I thought that it worked really well. Let's talk a little bit about the lighting setup for the night portion here. Can you walk me through how we lit night?
Yeah, so I started off with the Gemini 2x1 kind of behind them or behind him at like a 45-degree angle, kind of coming in at the same angle that the sun was coming in earlier. So this was kind of give a little bit of rim light to the actor, but also I needed something to make that metal stand out. So the chains on the swings and the metal of the swing set, also it's kind of like an edge light on those as well to help them pop from the background. Then the other thing I did is I took a Gemini 1x1 hard and put that kind of off camera left a little ways and threw that way up into the air to kind of get as high as I could. And I also kind of did a couple of different color temperature balances there. Because one of the things that Lynch does is he'll have blues and oranges and several different sort of color temperatures in a lot of his shots. So I went a little more blue with the big backlight. I went more daylight, I guess, for the Gemini 1x1 hard. And then I brought in Gemini 1x1 soft at about 3200, so a little bit oranger as a fill light. I probably turned it up a little bit more than just a fill light, but then I was able to adjust for that in camera. I also had a 24-inch 𝗂𝗀𝘀𝗀𝘀𝗀𝗀 tube off to the side that was kind of giving a little bit of fill on that tree. There was a different shot that didn't make the cut that was there for, to kind of bring the tree out, but I don't think that made it into the final cut. I tried the swinging from 2 different angles, and I felt like it just worked better straight on for the match cut than it did from the side, so that's why that one ended up getting cut.
So a couple of things that we've talked about in this series and series past is just because you're shooting night doesn't mean you shoot super dark, right? We still set our exposure appropriately and then grade for that. With 3 of these Gemini lights, that's pushing a fair amount of light. You want to talk a little bit about what it looks like in person versus what it looks like on camera?
Yeah, I mean, in person, it was bright. I think some of the BTS shots, you can kind of see like everything is pretty illuminated, and I think, you know, somebody walking past would, it looked really, really bright. But because there was a lot of, I guess, open space, you know, like the swing set, you can see right through it, and there's a lot of dark in the background there. So all that light really just kind of made those chains and the metal pop a little bit more and stand out from that background. But you know, in the grade, I also brought everything down a little bit more. I knew I wanted it to be a little bit moodier, a little bit darker, and I wasn't quite sure where that needed to be. So you know, I overexposed for what the final product would be, and then was able to bring that down later. It was more about balancing things out and like getting a little bit of dynamic contrast on his face, essentially.
So when we're filming what we'd kind of call mixed lighting, right? Because we have very cool kind of daylight neutral and then warm, right? And then warm. When we're talking about light with all of these different color temperatures, where do you white balance? What do you set it at? How do you make it look the way that you want it to?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's always, you know, it depends on the situation, I think. I shoot a lot of like live event stuff, like bands and things like that, and there's tons of mixed lighting on any stage. And for such stuff like that, I find like 4200 or 4300 to kind of be right there in the middle and work really well. So I kind of did a similar thing here. I think I matched it to the 1x1 hard that was off to the side at about 5000 Kelvin. And that looked quote unquote normal or white on camera, but then it also allowed the backlight to be a little more blue, and it allowed the fill light to be a little more orange. So I was able to get both that blue and that orange tone in the same shot by kind of setting my white balance right there in the middle.
And I think that depending on what a filmmaker wants the aesthetic to look, where you set your white balance in camera is what's going to look normal. That's what's going to look neutral, right? So if you want the background to go blue, you would set a white balance for the warmer of the mixed lighting, which would then send the cooler lighting much further into the cool, vice versa, if you want it to go warm. But it is definitely an aesthetic choice that you can make to kind of play how you want it to be. One of the things that I really like in this that feels very Lynchian in this first scene is the lens whacking. So, for those who are unfamiliar, like shots like this, right? This one, let's see here. Here's another one here. Like these kind of shots. These shots are all shot in camera. This is in real time. So, do you want to talk a little bit about the method of lens whacking and how you get images to look this way?
Yeah, it's a fun little technique that I love using. You know, I never really get enough chances to use it, but I think it works great for dream sequences. I'll do it a lot in like music videos where you kind of gonna have some quick cuts. Essentially, what you're doing is you're creating light flares directly onto the sensor of the camera by removing the lens. So the tricky thing there is keeping your focus, because now your lens is removed from the camera and you're kind of moving it back and forth. It's changing your focal plane, and it's allowing light leaks to come in. So when we did it initially, we were trying to use the sun and one of the other Geminis to sort of bring in those, like add the light leaks to it. And it was working, but it wasn't quite as much as we wanted. So what we ended up doing, we got a little flashlight and a couple of gels. And as I was holding the lens, kind of moving it back and forth, I had my colleague hold various colored just some gels right in front of the flashlight and basically shine the flashlight into the side where I'm holding the lens off. So we're getting direct light onto the sensor. Now the tricky part there again is the focus, because when you remove the lens and you're pulling it off, it's going to change how all of those optics work. So in my experience, I think somewhere around a 50 millimeter lens tends to work the best. You want to set the focal length to infinity, and then it's just kind of, you play around with it and you watch your monitor, and it's a little bit of, you shoot a bunch of stuff and then you bring it into the camera or bring it in the computer and see what works. Now this stuff I was shooting mostly at 40 frames per second, and the lenses I was using actually worked really, really well, and I think the Komodo as well works really well for this technique. Other times when I've used it, I'll shoot it more at like 120 or 240 frames per second, because those shallow depths of field, it comes in and out so quickly. And I think the slow-mo also kind of plays into the dreaminess of what's going on there. So I'll normally shoot it at a slower frame rate than what I actually did, but because of the equipment that we were using, I didn't want it to be too slow. It ended up working out pretty well.
So one of the things that is the most fascinating about the way that lens whacking works is the fact that you're not actually twist locking or attaching the lens to the camera. You're kind of just holding and hovering. Um, Couple things to note. If you do want to do lens whacking and that kind of thing, just be mindful of the environment that you're in, because of course, most cameras, especially your mirrorless hybrid cameras and things, have a weather seal between where the lens and the sensor attach. So you want to make sure that you're still protecting and keeping your sensor clean. That said, you shouldn't be afraid of lens whacking, because you're not just taking raw sensor out into the world, you're kind of hovering a lens near it. But it is something to be mindful of, is that you want to make sure you're taking care of your gear. But the way that you can get these things to look, the way that you get some of this cool rainbow flaring, the way that that focus even plays in and out and your framing kind of moves around, is all super, super, super cool. All right, chat. Do we have any other questions for Wilken on scene one before we move on to scene two? We're going to try to have time at the end, should you guys have questions that we can kind of circle back to. But I wanted to make sure that if you did, we get them before we move on. If not, we'll go ahead and we'll move into our second of the three scenes. Okay, before we even get into the lighting, one of the things in both of these scenes now, and I know it kind of transitions into the third one as well, one of the most Lynchian things in terms of kind of his style is the sound design. Talk to me a little bit about the way that you approach sound design, how it influences the storytelling, because the swing set sound from the nighttime sequence transitions into this scene. The drip is louder than it should be if it was real life, but it's definitely much more kind of built for the narrative aesthetic. Like, talk to me about sound.
Yeah, so I think Lynch does a really good job of kind of building a mood and like holding on to tension, both through his lighting, through his acting, what's happening on screen, but also through sound. I think Eraserhead, the first time I saw that, I was really kind of drawn to this like droning soundscape that goes throughout the whole film. And it adds this element of it's some texture, and it just makes it a little bit unsettling. So there's a little bit of that going on once our actor sort of disappears on the swing set, just to add a little bit of that ominous. Now the other thing is, now that's sort of the bed for it all. But then the creaking of the swing set and the dripping of the water were kind of the two elements that I wanted to sort of marry and kind of have be a bridge from one to the next. So if you watch the first scene into the second scene, the swing set sound kind of keeps going as the water comes in, and they kind of mix together to the idea is that it sort of ties the scene together for giving it a little bit more meaning. Even though this scene doesn't necessarily make sense in any way, I think it offers the audience a chance to kind of come up with their own meaning of what could be going on. By cutting to some of that lens whacking, and the sound of the swings with the sound of the water, the idea was the audience will be able to piece together that there's some connection between what's going on with him drinking the water and her disappearance on the swing set.
Got it. Got it. Makes sense to me. Uh, One of the things that I like about the way that Lynch approaches storytelling is that he doesn't feel the need to explain everything to the audience. He kind of just lets a lot of stuff ride and expects the audience to either understand what he's doing or kind of adopt their own understanding to it. I love the heavy contrast in this scene. So, talk to me a little bit about the way that you set up the lighting.
Yeah, so the first thing I did is I set up a 2x1 hard, which you can see on the screen here. I set that up outside the window, put that really high up in the air, again, kind of on the bluer side of things. And the idea initially was this was going to be moonlight. I think it ended up playing a little bit more like a street light than moonlight. But either way, I wanted this cut of light kind of coming in, hitting the sink a little bit. And my initial idea behind that was to kind of give a rim light on the water as it was dripping down. It didn't catch that as much as I would have liked. It's there, but the drip was just kind of going a little bit too fast. But it still worked as far as making the cup itself, when the drops were coming down in, kind of giving that a nice little kind of blue reflection thing going on. So that's where I started. And then the other thing was second thing I did was I brought in a 1x1 soft and kind of put that in the kitchen, put it pretty close to the ceiling and bounced that off of the ceiling, with the idea there is just to kind of bring up the general exposure. And then I took one of the small _𝗚𝗀𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 right above the sink. So all the other lights in the room were off. I just had those 3 going. And so I was able to get the 𝗂𝗀𝘀𝗀𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 tube to kind of be the, I guess, almost the key light for our actor as he's coming under the sink. I also wrapped that in some black foil just to sort of shape it. Those tubes are really nice because they're small. You can kind of fit them anywhere, but they don't have a lot of direction to them. So by wrapping in the black foil, I was able to kind of focus that light directly on the spot where he was going to be. And that also kind of worked with the water in the bowl as far as getting some more reflections, a second source on those reflections as the water was hitting that bowl. We had to play with the actor a little bit as far as where, we did it a couple times where he wasn't quite hitting the light just right because there was like a specific spot where I thought he looked the best. I kind of wanted his eyes to fall into shadow while still kind of having light on his forehead and his nose. as we can kind of see here. So that this was kind of the one we ended up going with in the end, but it took a little bit of tweaking on set to get him in that right placement.
Okay, so let's look at this lighting plot real quick here. So here we have the 2x1 outside up really high, casting kind of a diagonal shadow into or light source into the room to be a nighttime exterior light, whether that's a street light or the moon or what have you. So then you're saying that this Gemini was pointed up and we were doing a ceiling bounce. Is that what I understand?
Correct, correct.
Okay, cool. So this is a technique that we use a lot, especially if we're in spaces that are somewhat confined or have kind of a tighter space to them, where we'll use walls, windows, corners, ceilings to kind of give us extra space. One of the things that we talk a lot about in all of these videos is that the larger the surface area of that light source, the softer that light will be, right? So taking a 1x1, but blasting it into a ceiling is now making the ceiling the light source, which obviously has a lot more surface area, meaning that it's going to illuminate a broader area and it's behaviorally going to be a much softer light. So we can do that with ceilings. You can do that with walls. We do corner bounces a lot, especially if we're in tight spaces. So it's kind of a cool way of approaching that. And then we had kind of the tube light that was overhead, which is what's giving us that downward directional light. One of my favorite kind of shots in this thing, which you talked a little bit about, was, let me pull it up here, is that sink shot. Like, I love the contrast on this. So again, mixed lighting, right? We have this blue light kind of coming in from behind, which we are getting kind of in the reflection of that. And then we have the warm track light, which we can kind of see up and over and then kind of across this backsplash here. So we are getting really good contrast. Now, again, we talk about lighting bright and then grading dark. Can you talk a little bit about the exposure in this room versus how it actually looked in the edit?
Yeah, I think the exposure in the room on this one was a little bit closer to what it ended up being in the edit, compared to the nighttime swing set scene. Um, Again, I think I set my camera white balance at 5,000 Kelvin, and I had the outdoor one at about 7,600 to make that a little bluer, and I think the indoor ones were both at 4,300, so a little bit warmer. I wanted a little bit of orangeness and warmth there. Um, and also the kitchen itself was kind of yellow. It's like a greenish yellow paint, which also added to the color of it all. So there is this kind of like greenness to it all. And I think that's from it's from the plants that are right next to the sink. That, you know, that blue light is shining onto some green, giving it a little bit of green. And also the yellow greenness of the kitchen added a little bit of that as well. Which I really liked. It gives it something about just adding a little bit of green to everything. And I think in post, I did accentuate that a little bit on the grade to kind of bring that greenness out. It's just almost sickly, like I don't know. It just green just adds a little bit of a vibe that I liked for this scene.
I completely agree. We have a question here from Soren. I saw you added haze from a can. Can you talk about that, please? I'm always afraid that it'll trigger a smoke alarm. Cheers from Montreal.
Yeah, that's always a possibility. I was using spray in a can, which I think there's a couple different brands for that. And, you know, obviously you want to check with where you're shooting it, but where I was shooting it, it was not a problem. That haze in a can, I think it's a really nice tool to have just on hand. It just to give the air a little bit more thickness. So I would spray that. I use that in the third scene as well a little bit. Basically spray it, let it dissipate. To the naked eye, you can't really tell that there's any haze left, but it just helps the camera pick up that light. Just gives a little bit more texture to the room. So always check with where you're shooting, but I think it's a nice little touch. But you can also easily overdo it, so you want to be careful with that.
Yeah, two things. I've been on locations before that don't allow any sort of haze or atmosphere. And it's usually like places that will rent for a shoot that have an alarm system that's like tied directly into the fire department or something. General rule of thumb, wherever you're filming, it's usually a good idea to temporarily disable the fire alarm systems, whether they're just the screw-in ones or if there's a way that you can digitally go through and deactivate those. That's usually the best case because, yes, regardless of whether you're using haze or fog, you absolutely can set those off. Depending on the building you're in, some of them won't be by air density, some of them will be by like heat and that kind of thing. So it depends, but general rule of thumb is good, temporarily disable it. I will say there is a huge difference between haze and fog. Fog doesn't hang, it dissipates more quickly, but it's far more thick and low hanging. Haze is a water-based solution that will hang in the air for 10, 15 minutes at a time, and be a lot thinner kind of throughout. So it is important to kind of notate the difference.
One other note on haze is you want to be careful of continuity, because if you haze out a room and then you shoot for several minutes, by the end of that several minutes the scene will look a little bit different than it did at the beginning. So I always wait for it to dissipate and make sure that there's not too much haze in the room, because if you're cutting between different takes, one's really hazy and then another one's not as hazy, it's not going to work.
Absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. Okay, so any other questions on scene 2 before we start moving into scene 3? Craig, wish that when you were talking about the haze or anything else, you could cut back to the shot you're discussing. Oh, Craig, we can pull up shots and things. Again, to Matt's point earlier, this scene, you don't see the haze a lot, right? Like a lot of times we'll see projects and things where the haze is borderline overdone, where it looks like, the house was just on fire and we put the food out real quick. But really all you're going to notice if you haze a room, correctly is the wrong word, but lightly, is that it's just going to give you a little bit of what we would kind of call bloom. It's a little bit of atmosphere. It's something where we can see a little bit of the volumetric kind of components of the light, where when you think of like a dusty room where there's like beams of light that are coming through and you kind of see the dust particles floating through them, that's a lot of what we would call haze or atmosphere. But a little bit of it is just something to give texture between your foreground, your midground, and your background. And it's a good way of creating separation between the depth layers within your shot without necessarily drawing attention to it. Now, you can stylistically really jack up the haze and have like really, really thick haze, but there would be like really specific use cases for that. I mean, am I wrong on that, Matt?
No, I think if you're shooting like a spooky scene or something, there, yeah, I guess more often than not, you don't necessarily really want to see it. Is the rule of thumb, but a lot of times, there's a lot more than really what you might think that you need. A little bit goes a long way, but a lot can sometimes only go a little way. So like haze is one of those weird things. It really depends on the space that you're in and how you're lighting that space. This was pretty small confined space, so there wasn't a lot of place for the haze to go, and there was all the lights were kind of in one little area, so it's a little bit easier to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. Less is more. Generally, less is more when it comes to haze, and that's also going to save you from setting off smoke alarms nearly as often. Okay, so let's dive into the third scene here and then we'll kind of break that down. So without further ado, scene 3.
My broken camcorder can't seem to see the haunted visions you're giving me. No matter who I try to tell about the things you said, the memories are stalking me inside my rattled head. The blinking red that lights my eye, I talk to it, and it too I commiserate our stories past and those we wish to see. The haunted visions in my head stay poised and stalking me.
Lots and must hear you, voice personas, Sam, wasn't schnell to be.
I love this scene. This is like a quintessential Lynchian kind of vibe to me. Before we get into the specifics on lighting, walk me through the narrative here. What are we doing here? What's the idea?
It's one of those, like, I think I wanted to leave it up to the audience to decide, but it's sort of the third act of this thing. So this couple was on a swing set. She disappeared for whatever reason. He decided that drinking that bowl of water was the next thing that he needed to do, and then afterwards decided to sit down in front of the camcorder and kind of speak some words. At the end there, we sort of pan back. It's another sort of Lynchian thing where there's these like kind of pull outs or push ins with these longer cross dissolves. So I did a couple of those, and right at the end, we're kind of pushing into him as he brings his head up. And then we're pulling out from the television stack, and he's now on the television stack. When we pull out again even further, we see that he is no longer there, but he is on the TV stack. So, I think in my mind, philosophically, there's this idea of, the recording process. And once you're recorded, whether you're there anymore or not, that recording of you is there. So it's kind of a philosophical play on time and existence. And, in a way, I think like, taking a camcorder, recording, and then watching it 20 years later as a form of time traveling. So
I love it. All right. Break down the lighting.
So this super simple. The main thing I wanted was just one stark overhead light. So I used the 1x1 hard, kind of put it directly above the center of the scene. I put a grid on it, skirted it a little bit further just to kind of keep the light from spilling too much further outwards. And so that's my key. That's basically what's lighting everything. I also wanted to get a little bit of separation of the TVs from the wall. So I used one of the double rainbow tubes, made it blue, stuck it back behind the TV stack. It sort of illuminated the background. And then I just had a normal red bulb that I hung in a fixture above it, just to contrast with the blue a little bit. It didn't really do much from a lighting the scene aside from kind of putting a little bit of pink wash with the blue there. And then I used, again, the smaller Q-line tubes in two different places. One worked to kind of illuminate a little bit of the TVs, and it also worked as a bit of a rim light on my actor when he was seated in the chair. The other one sort of worked as when he walked into the scene, he was really dark initially. So I threw that up so that when he first enters the scene, we get a little bit of light on him until he enters into like the main key light area.
Cool. I love it. So one of the things that I really like in the way that this is done, all three scenes for that matter, but particularly with this one, is this like cool color, high contrast look, right? Because we have this really kind of cool illumination kind of coming up from underneath, right? We have this kind of cool color coming in across the front before we then see the key that's kind of hitting up and over here. So this spill that we're finding kind of coming up from underneath, where is this coming from?
Yeah, so that I have these big red rugs that I put down with the blue background, red and blue contrasting colors. You can see that a lot in Lynch's work. And like the red room, or he uses a lot of red. So by having that on the floor, I knew that I would get a little bit of red bounce coming back up onto my actor. And it actually kind of came out a little bit more than what I was expecting. But I like the way that it's, especially in this shot here, it's almost like you've got his blue sweater kind of contrasting with the red rim on the bottom of his arm there. I really liked how that red bounce was sort of working on his hand there and then on his face a little bit in the other shot.
So let's talk a little bit about the lighting plot here, just so we can kind of see this. So this is directly overhead pointed down, yes?
Yeah, it's kind of splitting the difference between where the chair was and where the camcorder was.
Okay.
So that one of really in directly underneath it, but I wanted again, similar to the scene 2, I wanted his forehead and his nose, but not necessarily his full face. And same thing with the camcorder. I kind of wanted the outlines to be sort of, catch those reflections and not necessarily show every detail of every inch of the camcorder.
So I don't know if we've necessarily talked about it directly in this series or if it's just been in series past, but let's talk a little bit about the purpose of a grid, right? Because we're talking about spill control without behavioral change. So do you want to talk a little bit about why we use grids and egg crates and how they contribute to the overall look?
Yeah, I mean, I think both the grid and the skirt that I put on it kind of worked to, rather than the light coming out and kind of going off in every direction, I only wanted the light going this direction. So what the grid does is it kind of creates that little tunnel where any lights that it's going to be kind of going off in any direction, it's basically blocked. It's like a bunch of little mini flags that are there to kind of keep the light only kind of coming down in the one direction. So I don't think we can really see it in this scene in any of the wide shots. Some of the BTS, you can kind of see it a little bit more, but it's kind of creating this, almost like a cone that comes from the light that's a little bit more focused downward. So if I did not have the grid on there, or if I didn't have the skirt, we would see a lot more of the camcorder. It would be spilling off onto the televisions. And I just used some black cloth on either side to kind of make everything else disappear. It would have shown onto that as well. So we would have seen all of that as well. So what the grid really did was just kind of focus the light just where I want it and prevented it from spilling out any further.
And one of the things that's really good for grids, right? If you're considering whether or not to use a grid, grids don't change the behavior of the light, right? We talk about light behavior a lot, soft versus harsh, right? In the spectrum that is the way that light behaves or interacts with the environment. A grid simply eliminates spill. So if you are working with a hard sourced light and you want to keep that light hard sourced, but you want to eliminate the unwanted spill through the scene, a grid is going to do both of those things for you. It's going to narrow that spread without changing the behavior. The same is true with a soft source light. If you want the light to be diffused and soft, but you just want to focus the area that it is affecting, a grid is the thing that's going to do that. So it will never change the behavior. It will simply change the spread, which is what makes grids unique compared to other modifier types for sure. Okay, so real quick here, going back to this lighting plot here. So we have this overhead with our skirt and our grid, and then we have the double rainbow from behind, right? And that's just solely for a background element, yes?
Correct.
Okay. So another thing that we talk a lot about is the idea of lighting spaces and not faces, right? Backing the lights up. So then that way we can illuminate the entire space that we want. And part of that is also making sure that we are lighting contextually, that we are lighting the environment and the background of our environment and not just the subject matter, right? And I think that that blue wall of TVs goes a really long way in terms of kind of giving us that vibe and that feeling here. So
Yeah,
then you
sort
have
of.
these two small bars, right? And you talked a little bit about that again, kind of as environmental lighting, so we can move a little more freely through the space. You want to talk a little bit more about how these are playing in relationship to our top down?
Yeah, so the double rainbow, the blue one, I wanted that to almost kind of give the shape and the form of the television. It's almost like a silhouette of sorts. And by putting the grid on the 1x1 hard, I was able to keep that light off of the face of the televisions. But the thing was, then it was kind of, you couldn't necessarily see that they were TVs. You could see the silhouette of them, but I also wanted to see some screen and get a little bit of tiny reflections there. So by putting that tube light kind of up above them, I was able to, and I made it like really, really low, like the lowest setting, I think like 25%, or maybe there's a 15%, but super, super dim, just enough to kind of get, again, sort of the outlines of the form of the televisions. I didn't want to illuminate them. I wanted them to read as really dark, but I didn't want them to read as full black. So that's where that, just kind of the edges and where the bevels would meet the screen. I think it sort of brought those elements out a little bit more and made it that much more recognizable as a stack of televisions.
I love it. I love it. Okay, Alex has a question here. How do you find the right balance between using unconventional camera angles and movements and traditional shots?
I think for me, it sort of depends on the vibe of the scene. I really do try to think of the camera as another actor, but also I don't necessarily want to call attention to the camera angle all the time. So I think with this one, I left it a little bit more just kind of slow push in. But then, towards the end, I wanted the camera angle to be a little bit lower looking up at him. He's a little bit bigger, a little more ominous, I guess was the vibe I was going for there. But I'll usually, let the vibe and the mood of the scene sort of dictate the angles that I'll choose. If things are getting a little more hectic, I'm going to go handheld. If things are a little more calm, I'm going to be locked down. This one I wanted to build some tension, so there was like slow slide push-ins, and I added a little bit in post as well. So I really try to let the action on screen sort of define what angles I should be choosing.
And I think that's the right approach, right? I don't know if there's necessarily like a cut and dry way that you should do that thing as much as it is what does the story necessitate at that time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would add would be that sometimes once I have all the shots that I know I need, if there's some shots that I think look cool, I'll go ahead and shoot them while everything's set up. And I think I did that in this scene as well, but once I got into the edit, they weren't really working. So any of the like kind of crazier angles or movements that I did, they didn't quite fit the vibe that I was going for. So I kind of practice like always shoot it and then, see if it actually fits or not.
Absolutely. Samuel's got a question here. Going back to lens whacking, if I'm using a camera that doesn't have detachable lenses, what's a good alternative? I have a thought, but I'd like to know yours.
I mean, it's really it's a lens flare is what you're looking at. So it would be the same thing, if you could get a very like pointed light, something that's going to give you a little bit more of a spot. And same thing, just sort of point it directly into the end of the lens. If you're shooting outdoors and you've got the sun behind somebody, depending on where you move the camera, you're going to see some sun flares. And that's essentially the same thing that I would try to emulate if you had a camera that didn't do that. I think, you're not going to get as dramatic of an effect, but you can get some flares that way.
The other thing that I would recommend is there's a filter type called a handheld diopter. And it basically looks like half a lens. So instead of being a full circle, you cut that in half and it's just 180 degrees. And it has a handle on it that you can hold. And it's going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to refract the light the same way that we're talking about here. And using a flashlight or a torch would do the same thing, right? Where it would hit and cascade light off of that in odd and interesting ways. But the reason why a handheld diopter gets you closer to lens whacking is because it's an additional lens element. So it's going to give you a little bit more of that distortion. It's going to give you a little bit more of the way that the lens is going to kind of play and shift and move. You don't have to spend a ton on them. You can kind of get them at any place you get camera or filmmaking equipment, but it's called a handheld diopter. And it's just half of a lens worth of handheld glass that you can kind of play with and give you some of the aesthetic that you would normally find with lens whacking.
That would technically not be lens whacking though, I don't think, because I think like
right.
Like the light is hitting the sensor directly and not actually going through any of the lens elements, but you've got the lens elements combined with that, and how that all works together is sort of what makes the magic of lens whacking. But yeah, you can achieve a very similar effect with a diopter or really any piece of glass, prism, putting that in front of the lenses, experimenting. You never know.
Yep. You're never going to be able to truly fully recreate lens whacking without doing it because of the physics of the whole thing. But a diopter and a flashlight's going to get you as close as you could with a fixed lens camera. Okay, so we're running out of time rapidly here, but now that we've kind of gone through and talked about each of the scenes, I kind of want to revisit each one and just let everybody kind of see them so they can take in some of the lighting and camera play that we've discussed and kind of look at these scenes with fresh eyes. So let's do that. If you have any last minute questions, throw those in real quick because we might have a quick minute there toward the end. But we're going to just go through each of the three scenes in sequence and then end with the last of your questions.
My broken camcorder can't seem to see the haunted visions you're giving me. No matter who I try to tell about the things you said, the memories are stalking me inside my rattled head. The blinking red that lights my eye, I talk to it, and it too I commiserate our stories past and those we wish to see. The haunted visions in my head stay poised and stalking me.
Okay, excellent work. Question came in during that in regards to the kitchen scene, audio wise. Were those real water drops we were hearing, or sound design in post?
Both. So there, yeah, I didn't actually record any audio while we were shooting it. I had the scratch audio to work from, and I sort of found some water sound effects and was lining them up, but I wasn't quite in love with that. So I actually went back to the sink and kind of set it back up with that same bowl with a very similar drip, tried to get the timing right, and then got a higher quality recording of it. Probably should have done that when we were shooting, but my idea was to kind of Foley this whole thing, but it wasn't quite working out how I wanted. So it was pretty much all Foleyed, but some of it was that same sink and that same bowl recorded later.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we are rapidly running out of time here. Matt, is there a place people can find you online should they want to kind of connect with you in the future, ask you more questions about your shoot?
Yeah, I guess you know, my Instagram is probably the best place. I think 𝗍𝗍𝗄𝑧𝑒r, THEWZER, would be where you find me there. I also have a website, 𝗵atwilken.com. You know, you can reach out to me via that, but social media Instagram's probably the best option for them.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, big W's in chat for Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, thank you so much for such a wonderful year. It's fun doing new and different things each year. Again, we've got big plans for 2025. If you do want to know what we're doing next year, tune into all of that. Make sure you follow me and Light Panels on Instagram. Subscribe to both channels on YouTube. Thanks to Light Panels for hosting this. I am having a ball continuing to do this and getting to interact with you. If you all have questions about what we've filmed this year or filmmaking questions in general, please feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. That's where I am most active. Thanks again to Light Panels. I appreciate the opportunity. I love hosting and hanging out with you guys. Have a wonderful holiday season. Enjoy the rest of your 2024, and I will see you all in the new year. Thanks.